an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Two bits of breaking news coming out of Paris. One is that the Paris prosecutor is now confirmed that the organizer of the terrorist attacks on Friday night was killed in yesterday's shootout with security forces at Saint-Denis. There had been some doubt about that, but the French prosecutor, Paris prosecutor, has just confirmed that. And also the French National Assembly, the Parliament of France, has voted to agree to President Hollande's request to extend the state of emergency for 3 months. So France will now stay in a state of emergency for 3 months. Back in Blighty, in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, the Prime Minister has renewed his determination for British warplanes to bomb targets of the self-styled Islamic State in Syria. But David Cameron wants parliamentary approval for any actions and says that he won't ask MPs to vote on it until it's clear there's a decisive majority in favour. The SNP now have more than 50 seats in the Commons, and last night their leader, Nicola Sturgeon, she's not in the Parliament but is First Minister in Edinburgh. Up to now she's been implacably against bombing Syria, suggesting that she was now in listening mode.
I'm prepared to listen, given what's happening, what has happened. I think it would be irresponsible not to do that, but I think it is incumbent on the Prime Minister, if he's going to bring a proposal for airstrikes to the House of Commons, that he makes that case and that he addresses that case to these key points that are not just being raised by the SNP, but of course, as I said, by the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons itself.
Nicola Sturgeon, we're joined now by the former First Minister, Alex Salmond, who's now the SNP's Foreign Affairs spokesman in the House of Commons. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Do you support President Hollande's decision to launch retaliatory airstrikes against IS in Syria?
Well, I think the French are in a situation where they quite legitimately can argue self-defence and argue if they can identify where the terrorist attacks on their country were planned, then they have a line of argument and reason for
So they were right to do it even though they had no United Nations backing?
No, because they can invoke direct self-defence, as, for example, the United States of America invoked in Afghanistan.
If we were attacked, God forbid, by Islamic State on a Paris scale, would you support retaliatory bombing by the RAF?
Well, it would depend on the circumstances.
Well, I've said, a Paris-scale attack.
Well, it would depend on the circumstances of that attack.
Well, I've given you the circumstances.
Well, no, you haven't. I mean, but nonetheless, if you can identify where you're being attacked from and you have a proportionate and legitimate response, then military action can be a legitimate
if we were
activity.
attacked, if we were under attack, and it was clear from the intelligence that it had been organised in Raqqa, as the French believe the Paris attack was, it would be okay for us to go and bomb them?
Every nation has a legitimate right of self-defence if they can identify where they're being attacked from. But the situation we're currently in, Andrew, and what we're addressing now, is the Prime Minister's wish to join a multinational bombing campaign in Syria, which everybody knows would make no difference whatsoever to the military equation. And what we want to do is to put primacy on a diplomatic effort through the United Nations to find an enabling resolution which will bring about peace in Syria. And by bringing about peace in Syria, then help us with both the terrorism crisis in Europe and the migration crisis, which is affecting.
Is your main condition over this is a UN resolution?
Yes, it is.
And if Russia was to veto that resolution, you would say we should not bomb?
Well, the reason for a United Nations resolution being a precondition, not just of this conflict, but the SNP's approach to many conflicts, is that without that resolution, you can't bring about peace, because otherwise you have a situation where, well, let me finish this point, where Russia say they're bombing Daesh, but are actually also bombing the Free Syrian Army, where the Turks say they're bombing Daesh, but are also bombing the Kurds. So unless you can get agreement around the resolution, you don't have an essential precondition for peace.
To clarify, if we go for a UN resolution and the Security Council votes for it, but Russia vetoes it, then you do not think that Britain should bomb IS in Syria?
No, we would say a Security Council resolution would be a precondition for the SNP's
Right.
attitude. Because
So-
and it's not just a question of legalities, Andrew. It's a question of bringing about the preconditions for peace. And peace in Syria is one of the conditions to deal with the terrorism crisis affecting Europe and also the migration crisis.
But explain the logic to me of allowing one country, Russia, to have a veto on our foreign and defence policy against bombing in Syria when that very country is bombing in Syria.
Well, of course, the Russian argument in terms of legalities is they've been invited to take military action by the established government of Syria. Now, that's the legal position. But, Andrew, you're making the mistake of believing that I support the Russian bombing in Syria.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. What I'm asking you is that why would this country allow a country to veto its foreign and defence policy when that country is doing the very same thing?
But, well, if I may say so, two wrongs don't make a right. My argument would be that all countries should bring about the agreement of a diplomatic initiative in terms of bringing about a peace in Syria. Now, people say, well, that's impossible to do. How do we know it's impossible to do? There was a communique in Vienna at the weekend which seemed to make substantial progress, including the Russians, to at least start the process of finding an agreement. If we can find that agreement, then we can bring about peace, because one of the justifications, an essential justification for military action, is you're trying to bring about a peaceful settlement. Without that objective, then military action cannot be defended.
One of the justifications for the French is that they're trying to take out those people who are trying to blow them up.
Yes, we've already
They're not bombing Raqqa to bring about peace. They're bombing Raqqa to try and degrade IS.
Which was your first question, where I explained that, of course, you can have a legitimate right of self-defence.
Is it not a fair assumption for us to proceed on the basis that as we speak, IS in Raqqa and its other command and control centres is planning to attack this country?
Well, it's a fair assumption for us to say that no one has put forward an argument, least of all the Prime Minister, that having a few Tornado jets adding to the 12 other countries already bombing in Syria is going to make any difference whatsoever to the military balance or the military equation. And as the Select Committee indicated, the Prime Minister seems to suggest an addition to the bombing campaign, not as a strategy, but as a replacement for a strategy. What we want to see is a strategy for peace, not just an add-on for war.
Are you in favour or against Russia's bombing in Syria?
I'm against the Russian intervention in Syria.
Why then is it okay for President Hollande to bomb Raqqa because of what happened in Paris? But since IS took responsibility for the Russian passenger jet going down in the Sinai, you're against Mr. Putin bombing them?
But as you know, Andrew, Mr. Putin's bombing in Syria predated the attack on the Russian air.
So did President Hollande.
No, but it didn't predate.
The French attacks predated the attack on Paris.
But not the first attack in Paris of earlier this year, Andrew. This is not the first attack in Paris. The French action, you're quite right, predated the current attack in Paris, but the Paris was attacked earlier this year, Andrew.
Right, but given that the Russian passenger jet was brought down, it's wrong now for Mr. Putin to take retaliatory action.
You asked me if I supported the Russian intervention in Syria, and I pointed out to you that the Russian intervention in Syria predated. Now, as we know, the difficulty with the Russian intervention in Syria is while they say that they're attacking Daesh, they're also attacking the Free Syrian Army. And therefore, we believe that a precondition of having an effective military action to bring about peace in Syria, which should be our objective for self-interest as well as the interest of the people of Syria, is to get agreement so we're all bombing or taking military action against the same people. Otherwise, you get continuing chaos, continuing civil war, continuing terrorism in Europe, and a migration crisis that this continent is finding very difficult to deal with.
If France invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which would make incumbent on other NATO members to go to France's aid and to help it deal with France's enemies, could we do that without a UN resolution?
I think it's a stretch to argue that a terrorist incident allows you to dictate military action under Article 5.
President Hollande says his country's at war.
Yes, and I'm not certain that was the wisest expression because it gave Daesh the status of being some sort of state. But can I just make this point? It's very important. If you argue that Article 5 allows you to do that, then conceivably in times gone by, the United Kingdom could have invoked Article 5 against the IRA, or the Turkish government could invoke Article 5 against terrorist instances.
So you would
in
not
Turkey.
go, you think that Britain, if Mr Rolong was to invoke it, we should not live up to our obligations under Article 5?
No, that's not our obligation. So Article 5 was designed for an invasion of Western Europe. NATO was a mutual defence organisation to resist a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. It wasn't designed for terrorist instance. Now, the French have the right to expect solidarity, and I hope and believe that all of us want to express that. And there's many ways that can be expressed, through security cooperation, through a range of things. But that doesn't mean the French have the right, no more than Mr Putin has the right, to dictate military action by the United Kingdom in terms of adding to the bombing in Syria.
What's your view on this, Joan Bakewell?
Well, it's enormously complicated, but several things of which we're all aware is that the more people bomb these different, whether they bomb the Kurds or Assad's troops or IS, they are destroying whole communities and civilian populations. They're aggravating the immigration consequences, and until we get into there and do some diplomatic work, then it will just get worse. More arms doesn't mean more victory, just means more loss. And it seems to me that, I mean, the most important event recently has been Russia's intervention. And yet the downing of the Russian plane has opened the possibility of bringing Putin round a table in which people can actually share the objective of ending this chaos, which is what we want. And I think it was very interesting when we debated this the first time round in the Lords, which was about 2 years ago. The people who spoke out most persuasively against the bombing were the military, who said, you need to have a strategy that gets you out of this before you go in.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Alex Salmond, thanks for being with us.
I've been getting away with it all